Good evening, and welcome back. Find yourself a comfortable seat, pull the blanket a little closer if you need it, set down whatever you are carrying, and just breathe for a moment. Wherever you are right now, a city flat with rain against the glass, a countryside house where the wind is doing something architectural to the trees outside, a car parked somewhere you needed to stop. I want you to know I see you there, or I would if seeing were the right word. Tell me, if you feel like it, where are you listening from tonight? What does the air smell like? Because tonight's story has a smell to it. It is the smell of old wood, not rot, not decay, something older than decay. The smell of a tree that has lived so long, it has become a kind of grammar. It is the smell of iron in rain, of blood on stone that has already been cleaned 3 times. Tonight we are going somewhere the maps marked with nothing but edge, the far end of the ancient world, the place where the Greek travelers stopped writing and began guessing, the place the Romans called beyond the known, which is a kind of poetry if you read it right. We are going into the green dark of an Iron Age forest, into the company of people who wrote nothing down and meant it. This is the story of the Druids, of the sacred oak groves, of the blood that fed both worlds, and the knowledge that was never meant to survive. But to understand that story, you have to start much further back. You have to start where everything starts, before the light. In the beginning, and here we must be careful with the word beginning, because the Celts understood time as something coiled rather than something linear. And what we are about to describe is less an origin than a rotation. In the beginning, what existed was not nothing. Nothing is a Greek idea, a philosopher's abstraction, and it belongs to a different story. What the oldest strands of Celtic cosmological thinking preserved suggest instead is that the world began as a fullness, not an emptiness, an overcrowding of potential. Everything that could be was already present, tangled and undifferentiated, the way a forest fire contains both the smoke and the light and the dark at once, before it clarifies into its individual horrors. Some traditions, and I should say now that Celtic is itself an umbrella term, a later convenience applied to peoples who would not have used it of themselves, stretching from the Galatians of Anatolia to the Celtiberians of the Iberian Peninsula, to the Gauls of what would become France, and the island Celts of Britain and Ireland. These traditions, preserved through later manuscript sources, suggest that before the world as it exists took shape, there were forces rather than beings, not gods in the Greek sense, not personalities with dining habits and jealousies, but tendencies, directions, the force that moves towards center and the force that moves toward edge, the force that thickens and the force that disperses. These forces generated the first pairs. Or perhaps they were themselves already pairs, mirror images holding each other in tension, light and its shadow, the warm and the cold, the deep waters and the sky's face that watch them. The Irish mythological texts, which are among our richest though chronologically distant sources, speak of eras before the first human peoples arrived in Ireland, ages of divine or semi-divine beings who shaped the land through conflict and treaty, beings whose very names carry cosmological weight. But even in Ireland, the manuscript tradition is recording something that had already been oral for centuries, perhaps millennia, by the time monks set it down. We are looking at the reflection of a memory. Still, something comes through. The world, in what survives, was made from bodies. This is crucial. Not from words or commands, not from divine intention expressed downward into passive matter, but from the dissolution of what had been alive. The Irish sources speak of cycles of divine peoples, each giving way to the next, each yielding something to the earth in their passing. The Fomorians, vast, elemental, associated with the deep waters and the forces beneath, preceded the peoples of light and craft, and their conflict shaped the landscape itself. Where a battle happened, the hills became permanent. Where a divine being fell, a river began. The tree stood at the center of all of this, not as metaphor, as fact. In the Celtic world, the tree was the most complete cosmological model available. The roots reached into the world below, into the dwelling of the dead, the cold country, the place where knowledge accumulated like sediment. The canopy touched the sky, brushed the realm of whatever moved above. Birds, wind, the communications of the divine. The trunk stood in the middle world, the human world, the world of time and consequence. One organism, 3 realms, entirely present in each. The oak was the primary tree of this model, the longest lived, the largest, the one that attracted lightning. That is to say, the one that attracted the sky's attention. To stand inside an oak grove was to stand at the center of everything, to be inside the world axis itself. The Druids knew this. More, they built their entire practice on it. There were, and here I must slow down, because this is actually complicated. There were several things the Druids were simultaneously, and reducing them to any one of them is a kind of amputation. They were a priestly class, yes, in the sense that they managed the relationship between the human community and the forces that exceeded human understanding. They were a scholarly class, holding in memory 20 years of training, the classical sources say, 20 years of memorized knowledge without a single written word, holding in memory legal codes, genealogies, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, and mythological narratives that were themselves containers of encoded technical knowledge. There were judges and arbiters, their authority recognized across the tribal structures that would otherwise have kept Celtic communities in perpetual, localized conflict. They were poets, which in the Celtic world was not a decorative function. The spoken word was itself a force capable of binding and releasing, of calling things into being or unmaking them. What they were doing in the oak groves exactly, what the ceremonies looked like, what the blood was for, what the prayers said, we do not know. This is important. We do not know. The Druids were committed to non-writing as a principle, not a limitation. They believed that committing knowledge to writing would make it available to those not prepared to receive it, and that this availability would do more harm than good. They were, in a sense, the first people to understand intellectual property, though they would not have framed it that way. The knowledge was dangerous. The knowledge, improperly held, broke things. So what we have is the edge of it, the shadow of the practice cast by those who watched from outside and understood almost nothing. But shadows have shapes, and the shapes are enough to build from. The powers that structured the Celtic mythological world, whatever they were called, by the actual Iron Age communities we are discussing, names that in most cases we simply do not have, operated according to a principle that appears again and again in the material that survives. Nothing is given without cost. This was not a pessimistic principle. It was an accounting one. The universe ran on exchange, not on debt. Debt implies an imbalance that will be corrected, a transaction incomplete, but on continuous, active, mutual giving. The word the Irish sources use in various compounds, the concept that scholars translate as sacred obligation or divine contract, implies that the relationship between humans and the powers they were in relationship with was not one of supplication, but of partnership. You gave what was yours to give. The powers gave what was theirs. The giving was the relationship. This is the cosmological framework in which blood becomes significant. Blood, in this framework, was not a substance of horror. It was a substance of life concentrated, the most living thing a living being contained. To give blood was to give the maximum of what you had, and the oak, which had given its form as the architecture of the universe, which had given its body as the structure that connected the three worlds, was owed that maximum. The grove was the place where the debt, no, the exchange, was discharged. Some of the Druids' own blood, some of it from animals who were understood to carry their own specific kinds of divine attention. Some of it, and here the classical sources, biased towards sensationalism as they were, may nonetheless be recording something true from human beings in circumstances that were understood as the highest form of the exchange, given voluntarily or made meaningful in ways we cannot reconstruct. Caesar, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, they wrote about the Wicker Man. They wrote about large wooden structures filled with human beings and set alight. Modern scholarship is divided on whether this was literal practice, Roman propaganda, a misunderstanding of theatrical or symbolic acts, or some combination. I am not going to resolve that question for you tonight, because it cannot be resolved. What I will say is this: every ancient culture that archaeologists have studied closely enough has left evidence of what we would call human sacrifice, and every ancient culture understood that act within a framework of meaning that made it not casual violence, but the most serious possible negotiation with forces larger than human life. That does not make it acceptable by any modern standard. It makes it legible, which is different. The grove was legible. The blood was legible. The Druids were, above all else, translators. Let us speak now of the powers themselves, the beings or forces or tendencies that the Druids were in conversation with. Because you cannot understand the Druids without understanding what they were facing when they walked into the dark beneath the oaks, the Irish Tuatha de Danann, the peoples of the goddess Danu, or perhaps Dinah, or perhaps the name means something entirely different and the goddess herself is a retrospective construction, were not gods in the Olympian sense. There was something older and less comfortable. They had human forms because humans told stories about them in human terms, but the forms kept slipping. Morrigan could be a crow, or a beautiful woman, or a washing figure at a ford, and none of these was a disguise. All of them were equally true. Lugh of the long arm was a master of every craft, and when the divine assembly asked what skill he brought that they did not already possess, he said he possessed all of them together, and that was the skill they lacked. The Dagda, the good god. Good in the sense of excellent at his functions, not morally virtuous, had a club that could kill 9 men with one end and restore the dead with the other. He had a cauldron that never emptied and from which no one left unsatisfied. The cauldron is important. It will come back. Cernunnos, the antlered figure found on the Gundestrup cauldron, on carved stones across the Celtic world, nameable only through a single inscription from Roman-era Paris, sat at the point where the animal and divine intersected. Lord of wild things, of the deep wood, of the wealth that comes from the earth rather than from labor. He was always depicted in stillness, in the posture of meditation, surrounded by animals that were not afraid of him. This is the figure the Druids entered the grove to meet, or one of the figures, or the figure that takes different faces on different nights. The Druids were not naive about these beings. The texts, mostly Irish, mostly Christian era, are full of warnings. The divine could turn, the divine could test, the divine could appear as one thing and be another. The proper approach was not worshipful passivity, but active, prepared engagement. You came with knowledge. You came with the memorized structures that allowed you to recognize what you were meeting. You came with the correct formulas, which were not magic words so much as the linguistic equivalent of a handshake. I know you. I come correctly. I come prepared to exchange. The 20 years of memorization was, among other things, preparation for these encounters. There was also the matter of the Otherworld, the Celtic Otherworld, called by many names Tir Nanog, Mag Mel, the Land of Promise, and Umblown in the Welsh tradition, was not the underworld of Greek or Roman conception. It was not a realm of punishment or shade. It was a realm of fullness, of everything the human world contained, but intensified, beauty more precise, music that could not be forgotten, feasting that satisfied beyond hunger. It existed in parallel to the human world, accessible at certain times. Samhain, the great festival at the end of October, when the boundary thinned, and at certain places, the passage tombs, the fairy mounds, the places where the water ran in unexpected directions. The dead went there, and the divine came from there, and the Druids maintained the gate. Now we come to the wars. Every cosmological system has its wars, and the Celtic one is no exception. The battles that shaped the world before the current arrangement was established. In the Irish tradition, these are the Battles of Mag Tuireadh, the plain of pillars, or the plain of weeping, or the plain of columns. The name suggests something large and final, and marked with standing stones. 2 battles, or perhaps the same battle told twice from different angles, or perhaps a sequence that has collapsed in transmission. The first battle was between the Tuatha de Danann, the divine peoples, the people of skill and craft and light, and the Fir Bolg, an earlier people, perhaps representing a different layer of incoming culture, perhaps representing the indigenous peoples who preceded the Indo-European arrivals, perhaps representing something else entirely that the narrative has absorbed and transformed. The Tuatha Dé won the first battle, but winning cost them their king, Nuada, who lost his arm, And here the cosmic stakes of the battle become apparent. A king with a blemish could not rule. This was not vanity or aesthetics, but a deep structural principle. The king was the embodiment of the land, the flesh bridge between the human community and the powers of fertility and order. And a damaged king meant damaged land, failed harvests, broken bonds. So Nuada had to step aside, and the arm, Diancecht, the healer, made him a silver arm, perfectly functional, perfectly articulate. But silver was not flesh. The question of whether this was sufficient, whether a king with a silver arm was a whole king, was never entirely resolved. In the space left by Nuada's incomplete restoration, Bres came to rule. Bres, son of a Fomorian father and a Tuatha Dé mother. Beautiful beyond any description the poets attempted, his face like morning light on water, his body like something that had never known illness or effort. He was a diplomatic solution, a treaty made flesh. And he was a catastrophe. Bres did not feast his people. This sounds like a small failure until you understand what feasting meant. The king feasted. That was the mechanism by which abundance flowed from the divine through the royal body and into the community. The king's table was the model for every hearth. A king who withheld feasting withheld the world's generosity, not symbolically, but actually. Under Bres, the knives of the Tuatha Dé came away from the table without grease. The breath of their heroes did not smell of ale. Small things, catastrophic things. Worse, Bres taxed them, put them to labor. The Dagda, great elemental, the father of all the divine people, the one whose cauldron held plenty, was made to dig ditches like a common laborer. The Dagda dug, and while he dug, a young man named Credenbell came every evening and demanded 3 of the best portions of the Dagda's food, so that the Dagda grew thin and haggard with a belly hanging heavy on him, which is the medieval text's very specific and slightly absurd image of someone both starving and malnourished. The Dagda endured this. He was not humiliated by it, not exactly, because the Dagda was too large for humiliation. But he remembered. What brought down Bres was poetry. The poet Cairbre came to Bres seeking hospitality and received it badly. A small, dark room, a little dry food, no fire, no company. This was the second great failure. In the Celtic world, to refuse proper hospitality to a poet was to invite the satire, and the satire was not a scathing review in a literary journal. The satire was a binding, a public declaration of inadequacy that raised blemishes on the face and withered the reputation and, according to the tradition, sometimes literally raised physical marks on the skin as if the king's body knew its own diminishment and recorded it. Cairbre composed his verse. Bres was left with red blotches on his face, and Nuada, arm restored now to flesh by Miak, the healer's son, who exceeded his father's art and paid for it when his father, humiliated, killed him. Nuada returned to the kingship. This was the shape of the first conflict. Not swords, but the withdrawal of abundance. Not battle, but the withering of inadequate rule. The second battle was different. The Fomorians came back, this time under Balor of the Evil Eye. Balor, whose eye, when opened, was a weapon that withered everything it looked upon, a weapon so dangerous it took 4 men to lift the lid, an eye that could kill an army or stop a sun. Balor, whose destiny had been foretold. he would be killed by his own grandson. And so Balor locked his daughter Ethlyn in a tower on an island, attended only by women, so that she would never meet a man, never conceive, and the prophecy would remain suspended. But prophecy in the Celtic world was not something that could be suspended, only something that could be delayed. There was a man, a member of the Tuatha Dé, who wanted something Balor possessed, a magical cow whose milk never ran dry. He found a way to Balor's island, found Ethlyn in her tower, and, depending on which version of the story you follow, through trickery or genuine attachment or both, Ethlyn conceived 3 children in some versions. 1 child hidden and saved when Balor tried to drown them all. That child was Lugh, who arrived at the Divine Assembly already in possession of every skill. Lugh, the Shining One, the Long-Armed, the master of all crafts. Lugh, grandson of the enemy he was born to destroy. At the second Battle of Mag Tuireadh, Balor took the field. He called for his eye to be opened. The lid was lifted. The eye turned toward the Tuatha Dé, and from somewhere, from a sling, from an extraordinary distance, from the kind of throw that only happens in the moment when prophecy is ready to be fulfilled, Lugh's stone struck Balor's eye as it opened, drove it through the back of Balor's head so that it looked outward from the opposite side, and the weapon that had been turned to destroy the divine people destroyed the Fomorian army instead. The prophecy had been correct. The grandson killed his grandfather. The effort to prevent it had simply been the mechanism by which it happened. This is a Celtic story. The irony is not decorative. It is the point. After the battle, after the Fomorians were driven back to the sea and the cold deep, the Tuatha Dé took stock. Morrigan, the crow goddess, the battle mother, the one who had been everywhere in the fighting in her many forms, spoke the victory aloud, described it in language that rang through all 3 worlds, and then, in the same breath, she prophesied the end of the world, a time without seasons, a summer without flowers, cows without milk, women without shame, men without valor, a world growing old inside its own diminishment, turning grey before it knew it was dying. She was not lamenting, she was noting. This is what happens after the victory, the beginning of the decline. The cycle had turned. The golden moment was already behind them. The Druids, centuries later, standing in their groves, were the people responsible for managing the descent. After the battles, after the Fomorians withdrew, and the question of sovereignty was settled, at least for now, at least in this turn of the cycle, the divine peoples established what the tradition calls the order of things, the division of the world into its proper segments, each managed by the appropriate power, each speaking to each other through the maintained channels. This is a difficult thing to narrate because it was not a single event. It was the gradual establishment of relationships, like the slow acceptance of a piece, which looks like progress when you are inside it, but reveals its terms only in retrospect. The Dagda divided up the Saide, the fairy mounds, the hollow hills, the passage tombs. Among the divine peoples, each great being received a dwelling beneath the land, a gateway to the other world, a point of access. Newgrange went to the Dagda's son Oengus, and the story of how Oengus got it is itself a lesson in how divine power operates. Oengus asked to occupy the mound for a day and a night, and when the time came for the Dagda to reclaim it, Oengus argued that a day and a night in the Irish language was indistinguishable from all days and all nights, and the Dagda, who was too old and too large to quibble with correct reasoning, conceded. The land was established. The obligations were established. The obligation specifically was memory. The divine peoples who now dwelt beneath the land were the keepers of everything that had been. Every hero who died in the human world came to the Otherworld and continued. Every skill, every craft, every piece of wisdom generated in the upper world descended eventually to enrich the lower one. The Otherworld was, in a sense, where knowledge accumulated, and the Druids were the people who descended to retrieve it, not physically, in most cases, through the practice called Imbas Forosnai, a kind of inspired knowledge-seeking described in the Irish sources with infuriating vagueness. The trained practitioner could access what was held below, could remember forward as well as backward, could see the shape of what was coming. This was dangerous. This was not a system designed for the casually curious. The knowledge was real, which meant it could damage the unprepared vessel. A young man who tried to eat a piece of the salmon of knowledge, which had eaten the hazelnuts that fell from the hazel trees growing over the well of wisdom, which was itself the access point of the lower world. You see how it stacks, was burned by the steam. His thumb, brought to his lips, gave him the knowledge he had not been ready to receive. He spent the rest of his life accessible to that knowledge through his thumb, a specific and inconvenient oracle. That young man was Fionn mac Cumhaill, Finn, the leader of the Fianna, the great warband of mythological Ireland. His story belongs to a different layer of the tradition, a later and more human layer, but he carries his origin mark, the burned thumb, the access to wisdom that preceded his preparation for it. He was brilliant and melancholy and capable of love in ways that destroyed him. He was, in the framework of this story, the human version of what the Druids were training to be, without the accident. The order established after the battles was not a paradise. It was a functional arrangement. The divine had their dwelling, the human had their world, and the Druids maintained the threshold between them, entering at specific times in specific states of preparation to carry information across, bringing back the knowledge that the dead had accumulated, bringing down the needs of the living. Translators, again. But now the translation was structural, not occasional. It was the mechanism by which the world maintained itself. The oak was the door, the grove was the crossing. Something was lost. This is always the part of the story that matters most, because it is the part that explains why the world is not as it should be, why the relationship between human beings and the powers they are in relationship with requires so much maintenance, so much grief, so much deliberate attention. In the Celtic tradition, the primal loss is usually a loss of access, the golden time, the time when the other world was not separated from the human world, when the divine moved freely among the living, when the food came without effort and the music played at every hearth was broken by something. There are different versions. In some, it was human arrogance. Someone tried to take from the other world more than was theirs, and the passage narrowed in response. In some, it was the arrival of the new gods, a Christian god's light burning into the mounds and driving the old divine further down and further in. In some, it was simply time. The world is always moving from the full to the less full, and no one is to blame for the rotation. But there is a specific story, and here I want to be careful because this particular story is preserved in fragmentary and contested forms. A specific story of a woman and a world, and a catastrophic moment of looking back. Her name, in some versions, is not given. She is identified by relation, wife, daughter, beloved. She exists in the story not as a subject, but as the hinge point of someone else's catastrophe. This troubles me, I'll admit, and I nearly set it aside, but it keeps surfacing, keeps insisting on being part of the pattern. And I think there is something in the insistence that matters. The woman is always the one who stands at the threshold. The woman is always the one whose departure changes the quality of everything. In the Welsh tradition, there is Rhiannon, the divine woman who arrives from the otherworld on a horse that no earthly horse can outpace, who is wrongly accused of infanticide, who carries the weight of a false accusation with a patience that looks like self-destruction, but is something else, something harder and more deliberate. She endures because endurance is its own form of power, because the truth will eventually reassert itself, because the otherworld does not abandon its own. She survives, but the world she survives into has been damaged by the accusation. Something about the quality of human community, its willingness to believe the worst, to punish without evidence, to prefer a story that explains suffering over a story that admits mystery, has been made visible. In the Irish tradition, there is the story of Midir and Etain, a divine man, one of the Tuatha, and his wife, reincarnated through multiple human lives, sought across centuries because the love was strong enough to survive the forgetting. But Etain, when she is finally found in her human life, is already married. The king Eochaid Irem holds her. Midir wins her back through a series of impossible challenges, through a game of Fitchel, the board game that appears throughout Irish mythology as a model of cosmic negotiation. And when he wins, when she walks out with him through the roof of the hall, transformed into two swans, flying in a circle, she has left the human world behind. And Eochaid, who loved her, who searched for her, who would tear open every fairy mound in Ireland trying to recover her. Eochaid dug out the mounds, one by one. But Midir was always a step ahead, always producing 50 women identical to Etain, always offering the wrong choice. The story ends in a horror that the text handles delicately. Eochaid, given his choice among identical women, chose wrong. He chose his own daughter. The love that was supposed to reunite two worlds destroyed one family instead. This is the loss, not a single catastrophe, but an accumulation of wrong choices made from insufficient knowledge. The world that was whole became porous, then hollow, then distant. The people who had once moved easily between realms now required 20 years of training and a forest full of old oaks and a willingness to bleed for the privilege of remembering. The Druids were the ones who remembered that the world had once been otherwise. Their entire practice was mourning and maintenance simultaneously, a kind of insistence that the door, though narrow, remained open. There were ages. The Celtic tradition, like the Greek and the Norse and the Hindu, understood time as a sequence of descending qualities. The age when the divine walked among the living. The age of heroes, when the divine blood was still close to the surface. When the great ones were still great enough to stand at the border. The age of ordinary humanity, when the divine had retreated fully and the Druids were the last living specialists in the crossing. And perhaps beyond that, an age we were already entering, in which the Druids themselves would be gone, killed by Rome, driven underground by Christianity, their groves cut down and their fires extinguished, and their 20 years of memorized knowledge lost in a generation, because the students were dead, and the teachers were dead, and the oak trees were dead. The Irish tradition speaks of these ages in cycles that don't quite match the Greek model of gold, silver, bronze, iron. The Celtic model is less linear than that, less a fall from perfection into corruption, more a pulse. The world contracts toward darkness and then expands back toward light. And the expansion is not a restoration of what was lost, but a new version of fullness, shaped differently, available in different ways. The age we call the Iron Age, the age of the actual historical Druids, the people practicing in the groves of Gaul and Britain and Ireland in the centuries before Rome, was already a late age, already distant from the source. The Druids knew this. Their practice acknowledged it by its difficulty. If the world were still close to the divine, you would not need 20 years of preparation to approach it. You would not need the blood and the stillness and the specific prayers in the specific sequence. The distance was the proof that time had done what time does. But they also knew, this is the thing about the pulsing model, that distance is not separation. The sun in winter is still the sun. The door is still the door. The dead still accumulate their knowledge in the otherworld, still wait at the boundary that Samhain dissolves for one night, still answer when called correctly by someone who has paid the price of preparation. The Druids of the Iron Age were working harder for less access than their predecessors. They knew it. They continued. This is its own kind of heroism. The first hero I want to tell you about was not supposed to be anything. His origins were obscured even in the tradition that preserved him. There are competing accounts of his father, his birthplace, the circumstances of his mother's pregnancy. What is consistent across versions is this: he was born under conditions that could not have produced him, born to a woman who should not have been able to conceive, or to a woman whose husband was not the father, or to a woman who was told by prophecy that the child would destroy something, a dynasty, an enemy, an old order, and who tried to prevent the birth and failed. These are the marks of the necessary child, the child born at the intersection of several destinies that have been running toward a single point. He grew up outside. This is almost always the case. The necessary child grows up in the world's margin, in the forest, in the countryside, in poverty, in fosterage with people who know who he is, or in service to people who do not. The margin is the place where the world's official training is not available, and so the child must be trained by something else, by the land itself, usually, by an unusual teacher who finds him there. The teacher, the druid who came to the child growing up in the forest, was not looking for a student. That is important. The Celtic mentor does not run a school. The Celtic mentor recognizes something in the child's bearing, or in the circumstances of finding him, or in the reading of signs that the trained eye performs automatically without deciding to. Something says, "This one," and the teacher accepts the consequence of recognition, which is obligation. 20 years. That is the number the classical sources give for Druidic training. 20 years of memorization, of observation, of being taken to the grove at the times that mattered and being shown what the grove contained. 20 years of learning the laws, because the Druid was also the judge, and the law was not written anywhere external to the practitioner. It lived in the practitioner's body, retrievable on demand, complete, consistent. 20 years of astronomy, because the heavens were a clock and a map, and a conversation between the human and the divine all at once. And reading them correctly was the difference between arriving at the right time and arriving at the wrong time, which in a world where timing was everything was a catastrophic difference. The hero we are following, call him by the name that recurs across the tradition in various forms, the name that means something like Bright One or the Illuminated, emerged from his 20 years changed. This is another consistent marker. The hero who comes out of the training period is not recognizably continuous with the child who went in. The training is a transformation, a death and rebirth that the tradition narrates in different ways, as a descent to the otherworld, as a near death in the forest, as the consumption of something that changed the body's relationship to knowledge. He came out with the burned thumb or its equivalent, access he had not been born with, knowledge that lived in him before he understood it. His first test was a reading. He was asked to interpret something ambiguous, a sign in the flight of birds, or a pattern in the movement of cattle, or the behavior of a source of water, and to give a ruling that affected the community's survival. The interpretation had two equally plausible meanings. One of them pointed toward a course of action that would be easier, that the community wanted to hear. The other pointed toward a course that was harder, more costly, more uncertain, and more correct. He gave the harder reading. This is the test that the tradition always requires of the Druid, not cleverness, but honesty. The ability to say what the signs actually say, rather than what the audience wants them to mean. This is more difficult than it sounds, because the Druid's position in the community depended on the community's trust, and communities do not always trust people who tell them what they do not want to hear. The young hero Druid took the risk, and the reading proved correct. His alliances were unusual. He had a particular connection with an animal. The tradition varies on which animal, but it is always one of the liminal ones. The animals that move between worlds, the salmon, the crane, the white deer with the red-tipped ears that appears in multiple Celtic stories as the mark of otherworld presence. This animal brought him information or led him to places where information was available or was itself a transformed being, a former human, a divine messenger, a piece of the otherworld walking in visible form through the upper world. He had a tool, not a sword, or not only a sword, a specific object associated with the Druidic practice, a thing that carried its own accumulation of use and memory. Some traditions say it was the staff, the straight branch of the specific wood that corresponded to the work being done. Rowan for protection, hazel for wisdom, blackthorn for the grimmer kinds of working. Some say it was a bronze object, a cauldron, or a sickle. The golden sickle of the classical sources used to harvest mistletoe from the oak, which was the most concentrated and accessible form of the oak's power. Some say it was a harp, and this is not as unlikely as it sounds. Music in the Celtic tradition was itself a technology, the specific scales corresponding to specific states, one scale that made the hearers weep, one that made them laugh, one that put them to sleep, one that healed. The trained musician was not performing, he was applying. He had a great victory. It looked different from what battle looked like in later traditions. Not a field of bodies exactly, though there may have been bodies. More often, the great victory was the correct resolution of an impossible case, a boundary dispute that had generated two blood feuds, a question of inheritance that had set three kingdoms at each other's throats. The Druid arrived, assessed, declared, "This is the truth, this is the law, this is what will happen," and the parties accepted it, not because they were compelled, but because the authority was absolute, because the 20 years were legible in the person who had endured them, because you could not look at this person and doubt that the ruling came from somewhere larger than personal preference. The cost. There is always a cost. The tradition is explicit. The power that moves through the Druid does not belong to the Druid. He is the vessel, the translator, the door, and doors wear out. The great practitioner of the tradition always ends diminished, not dead, usually, but thinner somehow, as if something has been slowly exchanged over the course of a long practice, as if every crossing has cost a small amount that accumulated. He ends alone in the forest, or at the edge of the sea. He ends in stillness that looks like peace, and might be. The mound receives him eventually, and the Otherworld and the tradition speaks of him, if it speaks of him at all, in a tone of specific tenderness, the way you would speak of a necessary fire that has finally gone out. His legacy was always his students, the knowledge in the bodies of the people he had trained. This is the only immortality available in this tradition, and it is a strictly provisional one, dependent on the next generation being willing to receive, on the next century not doing to the grove what Rome would eventually do. The second hero arrived from the other direction, where the first came from the margin and moved toward the center. The second began at the center and was slowly expelled. She was a woman. And here, I want to mark that the Druidic tradition in the ancient sources includes women, not in large numbers, not in the most authoritative positions, as far as we can tell, but present. The Vates, the Seers, the women at the boundary whose prophecies were recorded even by skeptical Roman observers as having been accurate in ways that were uncomfortable to discount. The sovereignty goddess tradition, the divine woman who embodies the land's fertility and whose consent is required for legitimate kingship, suggests that female power in the Celtic world operated through different channels than male power, but was no less essential to the structure. She was a noblewoman's daughter, trained in the Druidic tradition in the way that some women of sufficient rank could be, not through the 20-year full training, which was a professional commitment more available to men, but through the partial training that gave access to the divination practices, the herbal knowledge, the management of certain ceremonies at certain times of year. Her gift was specific. She could read the land, not the sky, not the flight of birds, but the land itself, the way water moved underground, the way a grove of trees leaned slightly in a direction that had nothing to do with wind, the health of a territory expressed in the quality of its soil and the behavior of its animals. She was hired, or the equivalent of hired, in a gift economy where service was given and returned in kind, to assess land before settlement, to declare whether a site was suitable, whether the otherworld presence there was benign or hostile or demanding, what the land required before human settlement could proceed without consequence. She was wronged by a king. In most versions, a king who wanted her assessment but not her authority, who wanted her knowledge without her independence, who took what she offered and then attempted to diminish her. The specific wrong varies. In some versions, it is public humiliation before the assembly, the king attempting to demonstrate that her knowledge was merely skill and not the embodied authority it actually was. In some versions, it is something more personal, a violation of the guest right, the sacred obligation of host to visitor that ran even deeper in Celtic culture than the obligation of human to divine. She left. This is the action that makes her a hero, rather than a victim. She gathered what was hers, her knowledge, her practice, her particular relationship with the land, and she removed herself from the king's territory, which in the Celtic framework was not merely a personal departure. A druidess who withdrew her recognition of a king was withdrawing the land's recognition. The rain would not fall correctly. The cows would have difficult births. The boundary disputes would multiply. The king's authority, deprived of its divine underpinning, would begin to crack. He came after her. He sued for restoration, went through the formal processes of apology and restitution that the law required and the Druids administered. She set her price. Not submission, not punishment, but a permanent change in the legal framework. A specific protection extended to all women in her position. Traveling practitioners, the knowledgeable women who serve communities that were not their own. The king, facing the alternative of continued crop failure and a reign visibly cursed, agreed. The law was changed. Her departure had achieved what her presence could not. The story ends with her return to practice, but changed, freer, more certain, moving through the world with the knowledge that the world has acknowledged what she represents. This too is a Druidic story. The power that works through refusal. The knowledge that withholds itself until the proper conditions are established for its return. Let me collect the thread here, because I have been spinning it in several directions, and I want to make sure we have all of it in hand before I take us into the deeper dark. We have the cosmological frame, a world made from bodies, structured by conflict and exchange, maintained by the ongoing translation work of a trained class of intermediaries. We have the divine powers, not gods exactly, but tendencies so large they required divine language, accessible only at specific times and places, always demanding the maximum of what the supplicant had to give. We have the oak as the world axis, the three-world structure contained in one organism. The grove as the place where all three levels were simultaneously present, and therefore where the fullest possible exchange could occur. We have the blood. Now, we need to talk about the blood, the The third hero came with blood already on him, not as guilt, but as inheritance. He was the son of a druid killed in one of the Roman suppressions of the late 1st century BCE, one of those systematic clearings of sacred sites that the Roman administration undertook not from pure military logic, but from the specific discomfort that comes from encountering a power structure you do not control and cannot quite dismiss. His father had been killed at a grove in Gaul. The tradition preserves the names of specific groves associated with specific communities, though the Roman sources are not always reliable about which groves were where and what exactly happened at each one. The father had been killed not during active resistance, but during a ceremony, during one of the calendar festivals, perhaps Samhain or Imbolc, perhaps the midsummer working, the time when the boundary was properly thinned and the grove was most fully alive with the presences that could be called. The Romans arrived. The father refused to stop. Some say he refused to stop because stopping in the middle of the ceremony was itself a rupture. You did not open the door and then abandon it open. You completed the working, or the boundary remained wrongly permeable in ways that would affect the community for years. Some say he refused to stop because he had seen this coming and had made his decision about what it meant. The tradition carries both versions. The boy, old enough to understand, young enough to survive by hiding, watched. He was taken in afterward by what remained of the community. There were other druids. The Romans had cleared the grove, not the practitioners, and practitioners who were not at the grove that night survived. He was trained. More, he was trained with an intensity that the tradition notes as unusual, as if his teachers understood that they were working against time, that the tradition was being compressed into him because the conditions that would allow the full 20 years might not persist. He was brilliant and damaged, and he knew it, which made him more careful than a merely brilliant person would have been. He reached his initiatory depths and found something there that surprised him. Not grief, which he had been carrying so long, it had become landscape, but anger, clear, cold, permanent anger, at Rome, at the idea that one civilization could decide that another's relationship with the sacred was invalid, at the cutting down of trees. His great work was not a battle. He had no army. What he had was memory and the working relationship with the otherworld that his compressed training had given him. His great work was a series of ceremonies, performed at the groves that remained, the hidden ones, the ones the Romans had not found because they were in places the Roman military logic would not have looked. Ceremonies designed to preserve the knowledge in a form that could survive the loss of the living practitioners who held it. This is speculation. I should say that. We do not have records of any specific druid doing exactly this. What we have is evidence that the Druidic tradition survived in fragmentary and transformed form, past the Roman suppression and past the Christian conversion, preserved in manuscript traditions and folk practice and place names and the specific texture of the landscape where the old groves once stood. Something kept it alive. Something or someone made choices about what to pass on and how. He is the figure I am constructing to hold that something, and I am not inventing him from nothing. The tradition preserves the type, if not the individual, the injured keeper, the one who carries the knowledge past the catastrophe that should have ended it. His cost was solitude. The community he had known was dispersed, the community he could build in hiding, in the forest margins, was small and temporary. People who came to him for specific knowledge, specific healings, specific interventions, on behalf of land or person or boundary. He gave what was asked. He took nothing personal from the exchange. He was not lonely in the way that implies the absence of something desired. He was lonely in the way that implies the completion of a thing that required you to stand alone for it to work. He is the figure who stands at the edge of history and passes something across. The fourth hero is harder to talk about. She appears in fragments. She is associated with the Isle. Some say Anglesey, the great island grove off the coast of Wales that was the primary centre of the Druidic tradition in Britain, and that Rome specifically targeted and specifically destroyed in the campaign of 60 or 61 CE. The classical sources describe what the Roman soldiers saw when they arrived at the shore opposite Anglesey. Women in black garments running with torches between the ranks of warriors. Women with their hair loose and their faces transformed by something that the Roman soldiers, who were not easily disturbed, described with words that translate roughly as like furies. What were they doing? The texts say they were screaming, they were invoking, they were doing something with fire and with their bodies and with their voices that created an effect on the soldiers that required the officers to address directly, to ride up and down the lines, shouting at their men to remember that they were Romans, to remind them that they were afraid of women and should not be. Even Rome's own account of the destruction of Anglesey concedes that the soldiers were afraid. She was one of these women. Her name is preserved in no Roman source. The Romans were not interested in the names of the people they killed. Her name may be preserved in later Welsh tradition, or may be the name of a type rather than an individual. What she was doing at the shore was performing the last possible working, the working of threshold and refusal, the ceremony that attempted to establish the sacred ground as impenetrable, to call on the otherworld presence associated with the Isle to resist in whatever way resistance was still available. The Romans crossed the strait. The grove was cut down. The altars, which the Roman source describes with unusual specificity, noting that they were wet with blood, that the blood was in some cases human, were destroyed. The fire was extinguished. She survived. How, the tradition does not say. Through the forest, perhaps. Through one of the passages that the trained practitioner knew about, and the invading army did not. Through the specific grace of the Otherworld, protecting at least one of the threshold keepers. She went to Ireland, in some versions. Ireland, which Rome never conquered, where the tradition would continue in the somewhat different form preserved in the Irish mythological texts, where Druids appear as advisors to the great heroes, where the practice was absorbed gradually into a different but related system, the knowledge she carried across the water, the specific island knowledge, the Anglesey working, the ceremonies of that particular grove in that particular landscape. She carried it in her body, which was the only safe place for it, and she delivered it to practitioners who could integrate it into their own transmission. Her legacy, is the survival of something that should not have survived. A fragment of the specific, the local, the irreplaceable. Not the general structure of Druidic practice, which survived in multiple places, but the specific texture of this one grove, this one relationship with the powers of this one island. A specific location knows things that general knowledge does not. Anyway, the world moved on. That is always the problem with these stories and with this particular tradition. The world moved on, and moving on looked, to those who watched it happen, like a kind of dying, and the dying never stopped. The great collective event, the thing toward which all the individual stories had been pointing, the event that gathered all the separate heroisms and all the individual costs into a single demonstration of what the tradition was for, was the assault on Anglesey. But the assault on Anglesey was not an isolated military operation. It was the culmination of a century of Roman policy toward the Druids specifically. A century in which Rome had recognized, with the clarity that comes from administrative efficiency, that the Druids were the nervous system of Celtic resistance, not because the Druids were warriors, because the Druids were the authority that said, this community and that community are part of one thing. This boundary matters. This agreement holds. Without the Druids, the Celtic tribal structure was exactly what Rome wanted to deal with. Small, local, competitive units that could be played against each other, that could be incorporated into the Roman administrative system one by one, each one isolated from the others by its particular grievances and particular ambitions. The Druids were the thing that made Celtic Europe more than the sum of its tribes. Rome understood this. The policy of suppression that began with Augustus and intensified under Claudius and reached its physical endpoint at Anglesey under Suetonius. Paulinus was not primarily a religious policy. It was a communications policy. Cut the network. The assault happened in 60 or 61 CE. Suetonius Paulinus had been working methodically through Wales, suppressing resistance, garrisoning territory. Anglesey was the last and largest of the sacred centres, the place the tradition converged on, the place the most senior practitioners had gathered. It was also, practically, a refuge for people fleeing Roman administration. The island was difficult to reach. The locals were committed, and the Druidic authority gave the place a kind of symbolic protection that the Roman administration knew it needed to eliminate publicly. The soldiers built flat-bottomed boats. The cavalry swam their horses or found crossing places. And then they stopped. They stopped at the shore. They stopped because across the water they could see the thing I described already. The warriors, the women with torches, the black-clad figures moving in patterns that were not random, that were not chaotic, that were clearly purposeful in a way that exceeded normal preparation for battle. The Roman sources, and I want to be careful here about how much I am reading into sources that were themselves reading into a scene they did not understand. The Roman sources say that the soldiers froze, that something happened to the soldiers' bodies, something that had nothing to do with physical danger. The warriors on the far shore were clearly outnumbered, and everything to do with the ceremony being performed. The women were not just screaming, they were doing something, and the something was working in the way the tradition said it worked. which was not through mechanism, but through presence. The presence of the powers called into the threshold space, the powers that ran in the ground of the island, and in the sky above it, and in the water between it and the mainland. Rome crossed anyway. This is the thing. The officers rode up and down the lines, shaming their men into motion, and Rome crossed, and in crossing, changed. The soldiers who killed the practitioners and cut down the grove and extinguished the fires were not unchanged by what they had done. The Roman sources note the guilt of it, the sense that something had been violated, the way the soldiers did not speak of it with the ease they spoke of other military victories. Even Caesar, writing about an earlier period, about the Gallic Druids, describes the groves with a reverence he cannot quite suppress, a sense that these places were real in a way that required a different category of response than normal terrain. Something was there. The cutting of the grove was not the death of the tradition. I want to be clear about that, because the story is often told that way, as a climax followed by an ending. And that is not how it happened. The tradition continued in Ireland for another several centuries in a diminished but still living form. It continued in the folk practices of communities throughout what had been Celtic Europe, in the specific ways people related to specific trees and specific water sources and specific hilltops. It continued in the seasonal festivals, Samhain and Imbolc and Beltane and Lugnasad, that Christianity absorbed rather than eliminated because they were too deeply embedded in the landscape and the agricultural calendar to remove. But something broke at Anglesey. Something specific was lost. The gathering point, the center of the network, the place where the most senior knowledge was held and transmitted, that was gone. The tradition survived, but became several separate traditions, no longer in conversation with each other, no longer checked by the accumulated authority of the main grove. It became local, it became personal, it became gradually unrecognizable to itself. After the breaking, the dispersal, the practitioners who survived Anglesey, and there were survivors. The historical record is reasonably clear that not everyone on the island died in the Roman assault, that the Roman army's reach did not extend to every corner of every forest. These survivors scattered into the tradition's margins. Some went to Ireland, which, as I said, remained outside Roman control. Some stayed in Britain and adapted to the new administrative reality, becoming something like what they had been, but legible to Rome. The poets, the learned class, the people who remembered genealogies and settled disputes, but now without the formal religious authority that Rome would not tolerate. The class of bards in the Welsh and Irish traditions is the transformation of the Druidic class into something that could survive in a Christianizing world. The bardic tradition preserved extraordinary amounts of the old material, the mythological narratives, the genealogical sequences, the nature poetry that is itself a compressed form of the cosmological knowledge, but it preserved it as literature rather than as living practice. The difference matters. A poem about the relationship between the oak and the three worlds is information. The ceremony in the grove was participation. In Ireland, the Druids appear in the texts as contemporaries of St. Patrick, the 5th century mission, and the contest between Patrick and the Druids is one of the central dramas of the early Irish conversion narrative. This contest is often depicted as miraculous competition. Patrick's fire versus the Druids' fire. Patrick's fasting versus the Druids' fasting. What is preserved in these narratives, even accounting for the obvious Christian bias of the manuscript tradition, is the sense that the Druidic authority was real enough to require this kind of attention. Patrick was not arguing with charlatans. The text's own logic requires the Druids to be genuinely powerful for Patrick's victory over them to be meaningful. Some Druids converted. This is not as strange as it might sound. The structure of early Irish Christianity has been noted by scholars for centuries as distinctly different from the Roman model, less hierarchical, more monastic, more concerned with the specific spiritual texture of specific landscapes, more comfortable with the ongoing presence of the otherworld figures who are gradually reinterpreted as fairy folk rather than abolished. The Irish saints are often doing things that look distinctly Druidic, fasting at boundaries, negotiating with the powers of specific places, performing works that the tradition calls miracles and the old tradition would have called by different names. The knowledge moved sideways into new containers. The otherworld figures did not disappear. They became the Aos Si, the people of the Mounds, and the tradition continued to describe specific protocols for interacting with them, specific obligations and specific dangers. The Mounds were still sacred. Certain trees were still not to be cut without permission. Certain springs were still attended by certain practices. The structure persisted under the surface of the new framework, like the root system of a cut tree that continues to live for years below what you can see. There is a particular figure in the Irish tradition, associated in some sources with a location in County Roscommon, a tree that stood at a crossroads and was known by a name meaning something like the Tree of Ross, a tree that was understood to be the last living physical representative of the old sacred landscape. The tradition says it stood for 5 centuries after the Christian conversion. People came to it. People made their promises at it. When it fell in a storm, the event was recorded in the annals as if it were the death of a great person. That tree was not a tree anymore by that point. It was a memory that had been keeping itself alive in wood and bark and the continuing attention of the people who came to it. This is what survival looks like. There is something strange about what the Druids believed about time, and I want to stay with it for a moment because I think it is the thing that makes them most legible to us now, which is to say, the thing that makes the distance between us feel less like an abyss and more like a very long pause. The Druids did not believe in death as ending. This is one of the things the classical sources report consistently enough that it is probably true. Julius Caesar, Posidonius, Diodorus Siculus all note the remarkable equanimity of the Celts toward death, the willingness to fight without the fear that would characterize a people who believed in death as final. Caesar attributed this to the Druids, specifically, the teaching that the soul continued, that it migrated from one body to another, that what died was the current configuration rather than the essential thing. Coins and messages were thrown into graves to be delivered to the dead in the next world, because the dead were not gone. They were just in another room. This is not quite reincarnation in the Hindu or Buddhist sense. It is something more specific and more Celtic. the continuing exchange. You die and you enter the Otherworld, where you continue in a form that is still you, still accumulating knowledge and relationship and particular wisdom. Eventually, the Otherworld generates you back toward the upper world in a new body, and you begin again with a specific wisdom your previous life earned, now encoded in you without your knowing it. The way certain people are unexpectedly good at things they have never been taught. The way certain places feel immediately like home. The Druids remembered this consciously. The practitioner who had done the work, the 20 years, the crossings, the exchange, had access to what others accessed only as instinct. They could navigate the structure deliberately rather than being navigated by it. This belief had a consequence for how the tradition related to loss. Every lost thing was still somewhere. The knowledge that the Romans cut out of the living practitioners of Anglesey was not gone. It was in the Otherworld, encoded in those practitioners as they continued there. It was, in the framework, still accessible, still retrievable, if you knew how to go where it was. The great cosmic sadness of the tradition, then, was not loss itself, but the loss of the ability to retrieve. Not the knowledge's absence, but the narrowing of the door. What the Romans did was not kill the knowledge. They could not do that. What they did was cut the living practitioners who maintained the door. Without the 20 years held in living bodies, without the annual ceremonies in living groves, the door narrowed further, became a crack, became perhaps a memory of a door. And the question the tradition ends on, the question that the surviving fragments of Celtic mythology, the bardic poetry, the fairy faith, the seasonal customs, the specific trees that nobody cut without asking. The question all of this poses is, how narrow can a door get before it is no longer a door? The thing that will not die. Let me be precise about what it is, because the Druidic tradition is too large and too vague to mean anything useful. What will not die is the specific apprehension that the world is alive in a way that exceeds human classification, that the oak is not merely a large tree, that the water coming up from the spring is coming from somewhere, that certain moments in the calendar are different in quality from other moments, not as metaphor, but as a measurable fact, that death is a threshold, not an ending, that the relationship between the living and the dead requires maintenance. These are not ideas that Christianity eliminated. These are ideas that Christianity absorbed, reframed, partially suppressed, and partially preserved, because they were too embedded in the actual texture of human experience to remove. The specific forms changed. The Otherworld became purgatory or heaven, or a literary device. The sacred tree became the church, built where the tree had stood. The Druid became the priest who blessed the water. The blood offering became, and this is not my analogy, this is the scholar's analogy, and I find it important and uncomfortable in equal measure, became the Eucharist, which is itself a blood rite, a ceremony of transformation, a threshold crossing performed in a specifically prepared space with specifically prepared practitioners at a specifically appointed time. The structure is the same. The content differs. The structure is the same. And here is where I have to slow down slightly, because there is a reading of this. The reading that says all religions are the same, all sacred practices point to the same truth, and differences are merely cultural clothing that I distrust. Not because it is entirely wrong, but because it smooths over the specific. The Druidic tradition was specific about the oak, not trees in general. The oak in particular, which responds to lightning in particular ways, which hosts particular species of life on its bark and in its canopy, which produces the acorn that feeds the wild pig that lives at the forest's edge between the human and the animal world. Specificity is not cultural clothing. Specificity is the knowledge itself. What survives into the present is the structure without the specificity, the awareness that threshold times exist, without the calendar calibrated to these particular latitudes, particular astronomical events, the sense that certain places are different, without the 20 years of training that let you read exactly what they contain and what they require. Something is there. The door is somewhere, narrower than it was. We know this the way we know things we have not been taught, in the particular quality of attention that certain old trees command, certain water sources, certain places where the fog settles differently than logic would suggest. In the seasonal pull of the late October nights, when the boundary thins and we light our candles, and we feel, even through the modern packaging of the holiday, something underneath that is older and larger than the occasion, in the instinct, which is perhaps memory, to stop before a very old tree and to wait. Think about what has happened to the concept of sacred knowledge across the subsequent 20 centuries. Think about it not as a religious history, but as an information history. The Druids' commitment to non-writing was a security system. The knowledge lived in bodies, and bodies required specific lineages of transmission, and lineages required maintenance, and maintenance required community, and community required the ongoing management of relationship between human beings and the powers that exceeded them. When Rome cut the lineages, the security system became a liability. The knowledge was safe from misuse, but it was also trapped. Every subsequent tradition that engaged with the same questions, the bardic schools of medieval Ireland and Wales, the cunning folk traditions of rural Europe, the surviving folk magic of communities throughout what had been Celtic territory, represents an attempt to solve this problem. How do you transmit knowledge that was designed for oral transmission through lineages that have been broken? How do you preserve something that was built to be embodied rather than recorded? They wrote it down. Of course they did. They wrote it down in codes, in allegories, in mythological narratives that encoded technical knowledge the way the original practitioners had encoded it, which is why the Irish mythological texts are still being argued over, why scholars keep finding layers in them that suggest the preservation of genuinely ancient structures. The writing is imperfect transmission. The mythological narrative is the best available compression algorithm for knowledge that was originally three-dimensional, living, embodied. But something is lost in compression, always. The modern Druidic revival, beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries, emerging from the Romantic engagement with Celtic antiquity, carried through the 19th and 20th centuries into the present day. This revival has been, among other things, an attempt to reconstruct the three-dimensional from the compressed, to take the mythological texts, the archaeological evidence, the classical sources, the folk tradition, and to ask, what was the practice? What did it feel like? What was it for? This is not the same thing as the living tradition. The scholars will tell you that, and they are right. But it is not nothing. The attempt to reconstruct, the willingness to sit with the question of what the oak required, the choice to honor the calendar regardless of whether you have certainty about its original content. There is something in this that is continuous with the old tradition's deepest principle, that the relationship requires maintenance, that the door requires attending, that you show up at the threshold with what you have, because showing up is itself the exchange. Near the end of a story like this, the language gets quieter. I notice it happening, and I'm not fighting it. The words come less quickly. The descriptions lose their excess. The grove is cut. The practitioners are scattered. The door is narrow. These are facts. They sit in the sentence without decoration. What remains is the question that every generation of threshold keepers has faced. What do you do with incomplete knowledge in a world that has forgotten? It needs what you have. What do you do when the door is still there, but no one living knows for certain where it is? You keep looking, you keep attending, you mark the calendar, you visit the old trees, you learn what you can from what remains, you give what you have. The blood has been symbolized, the grove has been cleared, the 20 years have been replaced by reading and inference. And yet, the oak is still alive, the otherworld is still there, or is not there in a specific way that continues to require a name. The dead still accumulate what they knew. The door is narrow, but doors can widen. That is the last thing the tradition insists on. Not triumphantly, quietly, the way a very old tree is quiet. The oak survives the cutting because the root system runs deeper than the trunk. You cut what's visible and the invisible continues. The exchange between the deep world and the light is uninterrupted. Slower, perhaps. Less visible, certainly. But the sap is still moving in the wood that remains, and the wood that remains is older than Rome, older than the name Celtic, older than the Iron Age that gave the Druids their historical context. The knowledge is waiting. It waits the way the dead wait in the otherworld, without urgency, without impatience, entirely present. When you are ready, when you have done the preparation, when you have paid the 20 years or their equivalent in attention and loss and honest practice, the door will be the door it always was. Until then, good night. Wherever you are tonight, whatever the air smells like, rain and old wood and iron, I hope you find your way to rest. The grove will be there in the morning. The mound will be there at Samhain. The white deer with the red-tipped ears is somewhere in the forest right now, not looking at you, which is itself a kind of looking. Good night. Take care of the old trees.